College football nerds here talking Alabama and LSU. Got my Halloween loving friend Josh with me to get nerdy with y'all, and we are going to get deep on this game. First, I want to remind you, please subscribe. Helps us out a whole lot. Also want to remind you, collegefootballnerds.com, we released a model-driven power rating 1 through 133, all teams. You can kind of check that out and see what's going on there. It's kind of fun to play around with. Nerd Nation Top 25 comes out every Tuesday. You can sign up and go vote. We got the pick'em going on. Obviously, box scores, relative performance, and that computer model that we're going to talk through in this game or for this game in this preview. You can go simulate any two teams that you would like. Even last week, so we checked it 2 weeks ago. I think it was 70% against the spread. Last week, even with all the craziness going on and all the upsets, it was still 57% against the spread. So I don't know that it's long-term super sustainable to be that good, but so far it's looking pretty good, and we've actually changed the model a little bit. Josh has noted, added about 5 times the complexity than the one we launched with at the beginning of the season. All right, Josh, this game is interesting to me because it's the best offense in the country. I said it. It's better than Washington. I think it's better than Georgia. Best offense in the country versus the best defense in the country. And Alabama's defense has flown a little bit under the radar because of their offensive problems, because they haven't been in that like top 3, top 5 spotlight. They've already got a loss. They've had some ugly wins. And so people maybe assume that this is the Alabama defense that we've seen in years past that's been good, not great under Pete Golding. This defense is elite, but also this LSU offense is a step above where they were last year, particularly in the run game. They're getting a lot more production. And I know we're going to get into the LSU defensive injuries in a little bit, but just that matchup, LSU offense, Alabama defense, talk through that a little bit about what interests you.
Really, it's sort of the unstoppable force, immovable object situation, because nobody has stopped LSU from scoring points this year. You look at the scoreboards for LSU, even in their losses, they move the ball well. The worst game was Florida State. Now, at halftime that game, it looked like LSU might have run away from Florida State. And I think even LSU fans would admit it definitely feels like the team kind of quit or let up and lost their focus and intensity in the second half on both sides of the ball. But outside of that game, LSU has not scored less than 34 points since the opener, and that's pretty impressive. And what's notable about that is they're going against a team in Alabama. They gave up 34 points to Texas and has not given up more than 21 else. Like, the highest point margin was Arkansas, and that was 21 points. Tennessee was 20 points, and everybody's kind of struggled to hit 20. So you've got an offense that nobody can hold under 35, and you got a defense that won't give up more than 3 scores. Something's got to give somewhere. And it's always interesting in those matchups to see where it is. And just to quickly kind of give the numbers, as you said, we've got the relative performance metrics, which talk about how you do against the teams you play relative to how everyone else did against those teams. And we break it down, game by game, team by team, and try to figure out how you're doing relative to your schedule. Alabama's 8th in pass defense, 10th in rush defense relative to their schedule. And, I mean, that's really good. It's hard to do a lot more than that, especially versus competitive teams, because, it's just kind of – Alabama hasn't played teams that you could necessarily shut down completely. They've all been good enough that they're going to get some yardage, and you're still holding it to that degree. And then on the other side of the ball, you've got LSU. I mean, LSU is 2nd in pass offense. They are 7th in rush offense. So – yeah, I mean, when we look at the model numbers, and you can go to collegefootballnerds.com, you can click on the model, run it between each teams, and you'll see unit versus unit comparisons. Both these offenses have an advantage over the opposing defense. Alabama's offense ends up with an advantage of 14% when running the ball, 28% when throwing. LSU's offense ends up with a 13% advantage running the ball, a 33% advantage throwing. So just about the same numbers, almost identically really on either side, the advantages to both units when offense is going versus defense. And that to me is always the game within the game here, because, Daniel, you did just talk about that LSU offense and Alabama defense, which you've done at length. But then the other side of the ball is the opposing units, right? It's Alabama's offense and LSU's defense. And what I think is kind of fascinating is when you break it down using these advanced stats we use like relative performance, the advantages are almost exactly the same. LSU's offense is so good that they have an advantage over Alabama's defense, but the defense is so bad that Alabama has almost the exact same advantage over LSU's defense.
Yeah, the only call out here I would say, other than the absences for LSU at corner, is that Alabama has shown the propensity to disappear offensively against bad defenses. And so if you're an Alabama fan, you have to wonder two things. Like, Alabama doesn't have to, we keep saying Alabama hasn't put together two halves in the same game this year. Some they've been good in the first half, some in the second half. I don't think they have to be second half Tennessee good for the full game to beat LSU, but I don't think that they can afford to disappear for an entire half, especially if it means 3 and outs, taking silly sacks, negative plays, short fields, not catching punts, which I think infuriated Alabama fans against the Tennessee game. That for me is where, like, on paper where you say, okay, LSU's got an elite offense, but their defense is terrible. And I'm sorry, LSU fans, this year got transfer city. It's terrible. And now you've got a bunch of injuries and absences, and Wingo might not even play. Like, most offenses would fully take advantage of that. And paired with an elite defense, it'd be a no-brainer. But Josh, what we talked about in the beginning of the season and what we've talked about for the entirety of this season for Alabama is they run a boom or bust offense. And those types of offenses tend to find times where they grind to a halt. And it's a lot worse to have a bunch of 3 and outs, maybe a turnover for a half, even with an elite defense against a good offense or an elite offense, and then pop a couple of big touchdowns. That's a lot worse than even getting empty drives where you keep the ball and you move it down the field. So if you're an Alabama fan, that's what you got to worry yourself with is, okay, maybe our defense is the best in the country and maybe we're going to get some stops. But what happens if our offense gets bogged down for 2, 3, 4 possessions in a row, which we've seen multiple times this year? At what point does even an elite defense, what point does the dam break a little bit? Because we saw that with Arkansas. We saw that in some other games. So I think that's really the question for me. What do you think, Josh?
Looking at the stats from the Tennessee-Alabama game, just to sort of give an example. So Joe Milton was 6.6 yards per attempt. We usually say 7.5 yards per attempt is competence. They had an incompetent passing game. The QBR that Milton put up was 75.4. QBR being ESPN's proprietary metric that's actually more situationally based off what the quarterback contributes. Jalen Milroe had a 10.5 yard per attempt average, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. His QBR was 68.5. That's more than 50% higher yard per attempt than Milton and a lower QBR. And that just really reflects the fact that what Alabama is getting out of Milroe is a few big shots and not a whole lot else. And a lot of the incompletions or some of the completions that happen just aren't keeping the offense moving forward. And the difficulty is trying to figure out, how sustainable that is, because I'm trying to do math in my head. I'm going to give up and just say, what's 176 divided by 21? That's 8.3 yards per play. That's what Alabama got outside one throw to Isaiah Bond. And you drop it down, and then suddenly it starts looking like 7 yards per attempt pretty quickly because they had a number of long completions. And a big example I remember distinctly from the Tennessee game is there's a play where Alabama converted a key third down to Jermaine Burton where he kind of gets crunched on both sides. And they spent a lot of time focusing on threading the needle in that play. But if you go back and watch it, there's a blitz, and the tight end from Alabama runs just a little curl route to the middle of the field right past the sticks, right in front of Jalen Milroe, and he's left uncovered. Due to the blitz scheme, nobody picks him up. No one's got him. Nobody's within 10 yards of him. He's clapping. He's waving his hands. And Milroe does not see him. He is focused on that deep drag to Burton, and he threads it in. To his credit, he completes it. and Burton catches it, and it was a very difficult catch. But there are a lot of easy plays like that where all Alabama had to do was see the guy and dump it for about 8 yards right in front of him, and they would have had a first down without even being contested. And that's where Alabama's struggling, right? They're going to try to make these big explosive plays. Frankly, they are forcing these, and I think at this point they've realized what they have at quarterback, so they're intentionally calling them as forced plays. They introduced Milroe a little bit as a runner. I've heard no confirmation of any sort of injury, but I wonder if those rumors from a few weeks ago maybe had some legs. Terrible pun. Legs, wooden legs, whatever. That maybe he was a little banged up because they stopped trying to run him at all, and they did a little bit at the end of the Tennessee game to seal it away. I know some of it, I think, is that Milroe's just not comfortable as a runner. And it's kind of funny because Milroe in many ways is more athletic than Jayden Daniels, but Daniels is a better runner. He's better at cutting. He's much more willing to engage in contact. He's much more willing and fluid in running. Milroe is a guy that's really fast but wants to be a pocket passer. And that's something I think people miss, is Daniels was a much more prolific runner in high school and early in his college career. Milroe was not a prolific runner in high school. He's just a very good athlete. And you can see that in the way they scheme it. But this all comes back to the other thing, which we introduced early, and I'm going to bring up now, and that is the injury situation at LSU at cornerback, because I think it's an overriding concern if you're an LSU Tiger that you're not healthy. I mean, Zy Alexander was starting at corner. Deuce Chestnut has already been not playing. Denver Harris hasn't been playing. It's sort of mixed signals on what's going on there, but it sounds like it's an off-the-field issue. Sage Ryan, who's really a safety, has been playing boundary corner, which isn't great. He's not really athletically built for that, but he knows what he's doing well enough to play it okay. Just haven't, frankly, played somebody probably that's capable of overly exploiting it since he came in. And now Alexander got hurt pretty significantly in that Army game, along with Wingo, who's one of the most disruptive pass rushers, especially interior pass rushers in the country, or was coming into the year. And now you got a situation where there's a good chance LSU's going to have two true freshman corners on the field versus Alabama. And yeah, they got some snaps versus Army, but that's Army, man. They're not a passing team, right? And so this idea of Alabama forcing shot plays starts to have a really different feel, because LSU, against almost anyone, when you have corners that are that new, you tend to be overly aggressive because you assume if you try to make them hold up in coverage, they won't. And now you got a situation where your corners probably don't have a lot of experience with scheme. They're probably going to bust some. They're probably going to struggle to play the ball in the air in coverage versus veteran receivers. So how does that take? And Daniel, I'm going to do the cruel thing you usually do to me and punt to you with the hard question and then let myself think about how I want to answer it for once. But is it a situation where Alabama, because of this, is going to be able to capitalize, that those shot plays are going to be open, and that Jalen Milroe is going to be able to have a much higher comfort level because he knows he can just throw it up for grabs, or he's going to be able to get rhythm early? Or is it going to be in a situation where, because Alabama is so boom or bust anyway, it doesn't really matter, because Alabama does not have any sort of reliable intermediate passing game. They are not going to throw 10-yard slants on you all the way down the field. They haven't shown any ability to do that to this point. Like, is one of those true? Is the other true? Is it a combination of the two? What do you think?
I think there's maybe a door number 3 here that has an opportunity for the Alabama run game to open up a little bit. When you have noob corners that are inexperienced, that are solely focused on just not getting beat over the top, and schematically they might just not want to give up the home run play, and they can't play a lot of single high safety. Like, one of the luxuries a lot of teams that have faced Alabama this year, playing single high and throwing run blitzes at them all game, has been they've had decent secondaries that could play in that role. I think this is a situation where you might see the Alabama offensive line not be overwhelmed because they're not having to block 6 guys, and the run game open up. One other thing that I think we'll see is the second half of the Tennessee game, there was a lot more creativity. You saw, I think there was a couple of quick pop passes to Bond, getting some players in space. It looked like that was something that they might have been saving for LSU and had to show it early against Tennessee to kind of actually win that game, because they didn't have the luxury of holding anything back. So I think that some of that creativity, though, might be there that we maybe didn't think was there. All of that to say, and we get this label of being negative on this show, but it's really just because we don't fanboy for any team. We kind of pick out the things that we see are your problems. And all of that to say, I think LSU's offense is so good that they're going to score. And I think Alabama's offense to this point has been who they are, and that is a team that disappears for 2, 3, 4 drives in a row. And I think we're going to see it again Saturday. I think that that's going to happen. Just until they're not that team, I'm going to believe that's who they are. Having said that, I also think that LSU's defense is just so bad that they're still going to give up points. So I think it's going to be a very uneven game where nobody's safe, but maybe the model thinks differently.
Well, I think the model isn't going to necessarily reassure anyone on either side of this because we have updated the model now. As we said, it's a V2 of the model that's running a lot more data behind the scenes, and we're controlling for a lot more variables. And it's almost dead even. So it has Alabama 33.8, LSU 33.2. And I'll note something off the bat here that's really interesting is we also do a power rating, which you can go through at collegefootballnerds.com and look at. By the way, you can run any model you want for free on collegefootballnerds.com. It's kind of funny. People were asking, oh, well, who's my team going to lose to? It's like, well, why don't you go to the website? You plug it in and find out, man. We put it out there for free for anybody to use. It's a big deal for us. LSU in our power rating is 9th. And Alabama is 13th. And the power rating is based off taking your team, and then we run the model recursively against everybody else in college football, calculate the win probabilities of each game, and say what's the overall schedule record that we expect. Meaning, if right now Michigan is number 1 at 1.44 losses, 130.56 to 1.44, that won't be sustained. But right now, they've hardly shown any weaknesses against anyone, so there's no reason for the model to think they could ever lose. But why do you have decimal points? Well, it's because this is based off, you have a 60% chance to win. So it's going to give you 0.6 wins, 0.4 losses, because it's assuming if you have a whole bunch of games you have a 50-50 shot of, that you're going to win half and you're going to lose half of those. And it's not just how many teams you're favored by. But the notable thing, right, in that calculation or in that world is that LSU's 9th and Alabama is 13th. So LSU is expected to win more games against everyone else than Alabama is. Yet, if you want any evidence of how matchup-driven our model is, Alabama's slightly favored in this game, 33.8 to 33.2. Now, the model does not take into account future injuries. It just looks at performance on the field to date. Long story short, there is no such thing as real data for injuries that are oncoming. I could stick my hand and say this player isn't going to play or this player is going to play. But that's an almost impossible thing to do because now you've got to find some way to compensate for, okay, I'm going to plug a true freshman in. What's his production going to be compared to Zy Alexander's? And maybe you use his computer ranking, but now I've got to figure out a way to approximate what that recruiting ranking is worth. At some point, it's just me sticking my hand in and tweaking it. And the whole point of our model is it trains itself based on these teams and their on-field performance just on this year's data. And again, 57% against the spread, even with last week's chaos, that's what it was at. So it does a pretty good job of that. But I think it's interesting that the matchups favor Alabama, even though it views LSU as a slightly better team to date. Yards per play, passing yards, rushing yards are all pretty similar across the board. It's about 6.3 to 6.5 yards per play. Actually, thinking LSU will outgain Alabama slightly. Alabama's passing yards per attempt is higher than LSU's, and their run per rush average is higher. So why is LSU's per play higher? That's a simple answer. LSU throws the ball more than Alabama does. So the fact that Alabama's going to be a little more successful at everything they do, but they have to lean on the run more, makes them a slightly worse offense, as weird as it is to say. But if you want to think about that through fully, if you're running the ball and throwing the ball a little better and you lean on the run, you tend to have less empty drives. You tend to have less sequences where you have 2 incompletions in the row and punt. And that little difference is why the model is thinking that Alabama will outscore LSU. Again, half a point advantage is all it is, because it basically sees Alabama as a situation where they're probably going to be a little better snap to snap. LSU is going to be a little worse, but more explosive slightly, meaning a little more apt to throw the ball. But on balance, it favors the better snap to snap more than it does explosiveness in this context when both are a little better than the other. But as we said, dead even game. Unit rankings are about this, almost exactly the same. 13 to 14% advantage to each offense when running, and about a 30% advantage when each offense is throwing. It is an almost dead even matchup when you look at the relative strengths, and it is strength on strength, weakness on weakness, relatively speaking. And I think it makes for a pretty darn fascinating game from a modeler's perspective.
All right, I'm ready to give a pick on this one. Taking LSU in this one. I know they've got a lot of defenders out, but we've seen I'm just someone that is not going to project things on you until you show me you can do them. And for me, I don't think against any other team on their schedule, including Georgia, if Alabama were to make the SEC championship game, I don't think there's another team on their schedule that would punish them the way that LSU will punish them for empty drives, short possessions, negative yards, turnovers, and that sort of thing. And I think that I've got LSU 31, Alabama 27, with a good chunk of those 31 capitalizing on Alabama's inability to be effective offensively. And people will take this, like people have been on us all year for Jalen bashing or whatever. It's okay to say that Jalen Milroe is the best that Alabama has, but he's also holding them back in certain ways. That's okay. He does make great boom plays, but he also has a lot of bust plays. The offensive line to me is elite, and everybody's crushing the offensive line this year. But if you look at a lot of the sacks that happen, they're him walking into coverage, they're him taking too long. I think Milroe has a chance to get there. I just don't think it is in this game. And so for a team that struggled offensively against Mississippi State, like Alabama beat them 40-17. There were 3 turnovers in that game. One was a defensive touchdown. So they scored 34 points offensively in a game where they didn't turn the ball over. The other team turned it over twice. Arkansas, they couldn't score on Arkansas, who is not a great defense, not a good defense, an actual bad defense. They couldn't score. So I see this as a situation where, yes, LSU's got guys out. Yes, LSU's defense is objectively terrible. But I'm not sure Alabama has got an offense that can capitalize on even a bad defense enough to overcome facing the best offense in the country. All that to say, I'm still so high on Alabama's defense that it wouldn't surprise me if Alabama can find any kind of consistency that Alabama wins this game by 3 touchdowns.
This is a very difficult game to pick. The early line is Alabama 4.5. You've got a lot of things going into it. On one hand, you have a quarterback that is, when Jayden Daniels been absolutely on fire. I think LSU is going to score on almost anyone because when you have the kind of receivers they have, which we haven't spent enough time on, and a great quarterback, it tends to pair together. Neighbors has been uncoverable to this point in the year. Brian Thomas Jr. has also been excellent. The whole receiving corps has been good. I don't know that the depth down the depth chart has been quite what maybe people have hoped. But at the top end, they've been so good that it hasn't necessarily mattered. And they have a lot of good options. But just to put it in perspective, we have a Nerd Performance Index version of QB rating. We're still tweaking, but we've actually gone ahead and quietly published it on collegefootballnerds.com. Jayden Daniels is first in our metric with a score of 1.68. J.J. McCarthy is second with a score of 1.43. That's a difference of 0.25. The gap between Daniels and number 2 McCarthy is the same as McCarthy all the way down to number 27 Graham Mertz. He's not just better than anyone else. He's better by a wide margin. And if it was my pick for Heisman, I think right now he would be my front runner. Record be damned, because he's the most valuable player in the country and he's been the most productive relative to competition. The problem to me is that injury situation at LSU. And we talked about various theories for how that's going to play out. And a lot of times, especially in games this close, look, if anybody tells you they know for certain who's going to win by a large margin, they're just wrong, or they're spitting hot takes. The question is, can you figure out what's going to be the actual way the game flows, win or lose? And I think that cornerback situation at LSU is pretty critical, because when you start losing guys at a position that plays 3 or 4 guys at a time, every guy you lose bumps, you lose your number 1 and you put your number 4 on. You lose your number 2, you put your number 5 on. And the drop-off can be precipitous. I think right now Alabama's offensive line is very good. I wouldn't necessarily call them elite as you did. I mean, I think the left tackle still gives up too many pressures. But sacks went down to 4 sacks last week. I think only a couple of those were really on the offensive line. I think 5 tackles for loss. I was looking at it earlier. They've gotten considerably better over the course of the year. Frankly, it reminds me a lot of what LSU's offensive line did last year, where early in the season they were giving up constant pressures, and a lot of Alabama fans went into the LSU game cocky because of that. But, those freshman linemen turned into studs, and that's what Alabama's doing. They've got 5-star freshmen, and they're starting to turn into good players. So the question is, do they hold up well enough? If they do hold up, is Jalen Milroe going to be willing to let the ball fly downfield? Are they going to be able to capitalize? I tend to lean yes. Not maybe to an exceeding amount, but enough for the offense to be effective. And if they do that, to Daniel's point, I do very much agree that offensive line is actually very good in the run game. They're maligned because teams have been attacking the line of scrimmage, because if you blitz a young quarterback, he struggles. When you blitz to the degree they do, it tends to result in a lot of run stuffs. But if LSU's struggling in the secondary, they're going to have to play too high safety, because they can't afford to let those corners go one-on-one and let a guy run clean by them, or you're going to give up a ton of easy points. That's going to open up the run game, and I think it's going to make Alabama a more successful team than maybe they had been to this point in the year. I'm going to actually go with a pretty high-scoring game here. I'm going to say Alabama 41, LSU 34. I don't think anything's going to necessarily surprise me. And I will say the biggest thing to me coming into this game is what's going to happen coming out of the bye week. Because the last few years, Alabama has come out of the bye week playing terrible football. And it's generally been against LSU. In the 2021 season, right? LSU goes into the bye week with a terrible defense. They have some soul searching. They realize they have one of the lowest blitz rates in the country. They amp up that blitz, and you have guys like B.J. Ojulari that just spent the entire game in Bryce Young's lap. And that defense looked completely different the rest of the year. In comparison, Alabama the past couple of years comes out offensively flat. They went 3 and out 3 or 4 times in a row against LSU to open last year in 2022. I think a lot of that had to do with Bryce Young having an injured shoulder. Based off what I've heard, I think Bryce Young didn't practice much, if at all, over that period, because we're trying to let him rest, and he came out extremely rusty. But it still drives home this concern to me that Alabama has generally turned stale coming out of these bye weeks more than they've come out rested. I don't know what that means for this one. Both teams have a ton of injuries. We haven't spent enough time talking about the fact that Alabama has been missing defensive starters off and on all year. They really haven't had a healthy defense, and they should here. Lawson and Malachi Moore I expect to be fully healthy. And, they were out, I think, 3 guys in the secondary at one point in that Texas game when they gave up 34. LSU's going to get a healthy version of Alabama. So, I don't know. But all those pieces put together really comes down to the fact that I think Alabama's a lot healthier than LSU. And given that this is otherwise, I think, correctly modeled as an even game, I think that's enough to give Alabama about a touchdown advantage.
I will say this. If Alabama wants to win this game, they can't have a slow start. In 5 of their 8 games this year, they've started with a 3 and out. That is so bad that it's like I can't even contextualize how bad that is for a team this talented to start a game, 5 of 8 games, which include games like South Florida and Arkansas and Mississippi State. 5 of 8 be a 3 and out. A 6th was a first possession interception against Texas. So you had 6 of your 8 games as Alabama, 5-star city, all the coaching budget in the world, all the preparation time in the world, and you can't get a first down against Mississippi State or whatever. Like, that is, to me, where Alabama's biggest problems have lied so far, is because that impacts your ability to get any kind of momentum, because then you start getting in your head and things start happening. So they can't have that happen in this game. If they come out first couple of possessions and just piddle around like they've done in most of their games this year, it's going to be 10 to nothing before they look up. It's going to look like that Auburn game. And Auburn has a good defense. Not as good as Alabama's. They have a good defense. That offense was digging itself out of a hole the whole game, which led to mistakes, which led to that being a huge blowout for LSU. So they need to look out for that. Anything else in this game before we wrap it up?
I'm ready to shove off.
All right, y'all. Let us know in the comments what you think the score for this game is going to be, and we will get down there and let you know why you are wrong. Remember, like and subscribe at collegefootballnerds.com. Check out the model. Check out the power rating from the model. Top 25 that you can do yourself. Pick 'em, stats, NFLU. Check it all out. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.